In this module, we will take a look at external or social reinforcement is something that can only be accessed through another person. For example, getting praise or reprimands, or even gaining access to toys and activities. First, we're going to have a quick overview of the Reid chapter, The Power of Social Attention. Reid discusses social attention and how interacting with other individuals is a fundamental source of happiness for most people. Even though the amount of desired interaction varies across people, everyone enjoys social attention at some level. Unfortunately, when working with those with autism spectrum disorder, many do not believe that individuals diagnosed with ASD enjoy social attention. A defining characteristic of ASD is having difficulties with social interactions. Therefore, it is not necessarily a lack of desire for social attention, but oftentimes individuals with ASD do not respond appropriately to or initiate social interaction. Reid then moves on to describe 3 different types of social attention that can be used. The first being positive attention. This typically involves both verbal and nonverbal expressions of approval, such as great job or a thumbs up with a smile. Something that the authors also note is that these comments must also be sincere, and by providing insincere attention, there may not be much of an impact on the individual. Neutral attention involves interaction that does not necessarily convey approval or disapproval. Some examples include asking and responding to questions. Negative attention is a verbal or nonverbal way of expressing disapproval. This can include scowls or statements such as, "That's not how it's done." Reid points out that there should be much more positive attention given throughout the course of the day rather than negative attention. Also, staff should be mindful of the individual preferences of those they're working with. Some enjoy lots of attention, while others may enjoy fewer interactions. Therefore, staff must continue to evaluate the needs and responses given by the individuals. The next article is by Worcester and McLaughlin, and they provide a quick overview of treatments for attention-maintained behaviors. They discuss how aberrant behaviors are susceptible to positive reinforcement and that these behaviors, such as aggression or self-injurious behaviors, tend to require some attention, whether it's a reprimand or comfort. Unfortunately, behaviors that may have occurred for various reasons, such as frustration or communication, may eventually turn into an attention-maintained behavior. When dealing with this behavior, consider why they occurred in the first place and develop a plan to teach an appropriate replacement behavior. There are several treatments that have addressed these behaviors, including timeout, differential reinforcement procedures, non-contingent reinforcement, and functional communication training. Warvet and Miltenberger used timeout and a time delay to decrease noncompliance of 2 4-year-old girls. They found that this was more effective than high probability, low probability sequences. Piazza and colleagues took a look at differential reinforcement of other behaviors, or DRO, in order to decrease the elopement behaviors of an 11-year-old boy. They provided attention or a preferred food item every 50 seconds contingent on the non-occurrence of elopement, and this resulted in near zero levels of elopement behaviors. In the same study, they used a differential reinforcement of appropriate behaviors, or DRA, in order to decrease the elopement of a 4-year-old boy. They used DRA along with a blocking procedure. Contingent upon appropriate behavior, the student was reinforced with either attention or access to running. This also resulted in near zero levels of elopement. Vollmer and colleagues compared the non-contingent reinforcement schedule to differential reinforcement of other behaviors in order to reduce aberrant behaviors. They found that both the non-contingent reinforcement and DRO were both effective in reducing aberrant behaviors. However, there were benefits of the non-contingent reinforcement in that it resulted in rapid reductions of behavior without the extinction burst occurring. Finally, this article discussed some interventions that include functional communication training, where a replacement mand, both verbal or nonverbal, is taught for the request of attention. We will now discuss some common treatments for attention-maintained behaviors. The first being differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement is when you provide reinforcement for the occurrence of certain behaviors. This is basically discrimination training, which behaviors result in reinforcements and which behaviors do not. The first differential reinforcement intervention is DRO. This is when you provide reinforcement for behaviors other than the problem behavior. So let's say the behaviors we're targeting is aggression, which in this case we'll define as hitting other students or teachers in the class. The child will receive reinforcement when the child is engaged in any other behaviors but hitting. So coloring, hands in their lap, etc. This may be more of a reactive approach and basically catching the student being good. One issue with this technique is that it may or may not necessarily address the function of the problem behavior. The next technique is DRA. In this condition, reinforcement occurs when the student engages in an alternative behavior or a replacement behavior that may need to be taught to the student. So, if the child is engaging in aggression in order to access toys or attention, an alternative behavior may be having the student ask the teacher for the toys or for attention. The advantage to this procedure is that it more directly addresses the function of the problem behavior and provides the student with an appropriate way to gain access to their desired reinforcer. DRI is when you provide reinforcement for behaviors that are incompatible with the problem behavior. So again, referring to our target behavior of aggression, I might reinforce the child who's sitting on his or her hands. It's tougher to hit somebody when your hands are stuck under your legs. Unfortunately, there may not always be alternatives that are truly incompatible with the target in a variety of settings, and again doesn't necessarily directly address the function of the behavior, but overall this is a good reactive strategy. DRL is when you reinforce for lower rates of a behavior in a duration of time. So let's say the student typically engages in aggression 10 times in a minute. I may reinforce the child for only engaging in aggression 4 times in a minute. For this example, 4 times still isn't good, but you get the idea. One pro, frequency is lower. However, the child is still engaging in an inappropriate behavior. Finally, we have non-contingent reinforcement. This is when reinforcement is given independent of the child's behavior. The idea behind this strategy is that you're actually manipulating the motivating operation. A motivating operation is something in the environment that alters the effectiveness of a reinforcer, which then alters the frequency of the behavior affected by that reinforcer. If you limit access to a reinforcer, you increase the effectiveness of that reinforcer. This refers to an establishing operation. Less access to it, increased effectiveness. An abolishing operation is when you decrease the effectiveness of a reinforcer, and this could be done through increased access to that reinforcer. This is commonly described as satiation. So back to the non-contingent reinforcement. When you provide increased access to reinforcement, and in this case, let's say attention, you're likely to see a decrease in behaviors that typically result in attention as they're already gaining increased access. Typically, these interventions occur with the extinction procedure, and this is when reinforcement is no longer provided for the inappropriate problematic behaviors. One disadvantage to extinction procedures is that they may come with an extinction burst. So, when a behavior that has been previously reinforced no longer results in reinforcement, you may see a rise in other behaviors to see if that will contact reinforcement. Another procedure is timeout. If the child engages in the problem behavior, there is a removal of opportunity to earn positive reinforcement or a loss of access to positive reinforcement for a period of time. This is to decrease the likelihood that that behavior will occur again in the future. There are a few ways you can implement a timeout procedure. Exclusionary timeout typically involves being removed from the reinforcing environment. So that could be putting the child in another room, outside of the classroom, or even using a partition to block them from the reinforcing environment. Non-exclusionary timeout involves keeping the child in the environment, but removing access to reinforcing activities for a period of time. The timeout procedure has been proven effective to reduce problematic behaviors and may be useful when you need to ensure the safety of others in the environment, such as other children in the classroom. Unfortunately, the timeout procedure is not necessarily the least restrictive intervention. There are some disadvantages to this procedure. One, you may experience an extinction burst, and also you may not have the space or the staff to implement the procedure. Finally, we have functional communication training. FCT is when an individual is taught an alternative response that results in the same class of reinforcement identified as maintaining problem behavior. FCT differs from other function-based differential reinforcement procedures in that the alternative response is a recognizable form of communication. An FCT occurs in 3 stages. First, you must conduct an FA, or a functional analysis, to determine the function maintaining the behavior. Next, you teach the student a socially acceptable communicative that will result in the reinforcer that maintained previous problematic behavior. Finally, the FCT treatment is extended across settings and caregivers.